Okay, thank you for coming back in on time so we can get started, and we'll promise to get you out of here in time for the reception sometime this afternoon. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Mike Barrett, who's Professor of Weed Science at University of Kentucky. Mike is also the Weed Science Society of America liaison to EPA's Office of Pesticide Programs, where he comes in about once a month, Mike, and spends 3 or 4 days working with EPA on weed issues. The title of his presentation is Incentives and Regulations to Manage Herbicide Resistance.
Thank you, Harold. So I think Harold started the day said he was formerly from the government and here to help. So my job is I'm here to help the government. So how dangerous is that? I'm like another order of magnitude dangerous. So I'm over here because when we came in yesterday and looked at the setup, my immediate thought was, this will be the closest I'll ever come to giving a TED Talk. So I'm going to walk around, and I'm thinking all the time, how do I get this uploaded to their site so I can make my students watch this, know I'm famous. Thank you for staying through the day. Thank you for all your engagement through the day. We do have a couple more things, and I'm really looking forward to Harold's call to actually the end. But I hope you can't tell that even though I am excited, I'm actually pretty nervous because I'm talking about incentives and regulations. I'm not an economist, I'm not a social scientist, and I'm certainly not a regulator. Most of those people are hiding. I really appreciate Jack being willing to come up here and talk in front of you later. What I am is probably a naive academic weed scientist. But with conversations with the economists and the sociologists on the team, we've come up with some ideas to throw out. I hope at the end you're not as scared as I am right now. Because I'm scared because it's not just about losing the tools that we've already lost. I feel like a clock ticking. That it's the tools that the few we have left that are still active and working in a few places, I feel like we're knocking those off. And so I feel like we have this window of opportunity to keep the tools we have now, and I think we need to do everything we can to preserve them. So I do need to advance these slides once in a while. So this will give me a break. I'm going to ask you a question right off. Who should offer incentives for diversifying our weed management programs and practicing herbicide resistance BMPs? 1, the federal government. 2, industry. 3, commodity organizations. 4, someone else, not the above, not me maybe. And 5, incentives should not be offered to do this. I've been thinking all day about 10-second jokes, but I didn't ever come up with any. Oh, that's interesting. So looking at the data you had said before, people said that industry definitely should offer incentives. There should be federal government payments, and then probably rolled in that for some of you is that the federal insurance policies should be amended to incentivize some of these things. So there are at least a quarter of you, though, don't think we should do anything about this as far as incentives. So I guess I'm talking to you most. So why am I going to talk about some incentives? Because they work. And because I really think they can move the needle for adoption of some of these practices. You've heard the economist talk about the hurdles, and you talked about that middle case where the uncertainty of benefits, where the cost is a barrier to adoption, and that incentives can move some of those people. You've had examples like the boll weevil problem, where incentives really made a difference. Clearly, in soil conservation practices, incentives, David was great talk about that, how they can be wasteful, but over time they became more and more effective, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But clearly they did make a difference. Industry incentives, the Roundup Ready Plus program, certainly made a difference in use of sole apply herbicides. A couple things about incentives. They are temporary, meant to overcome those barriers, not subsidies. They don't guarantee the adoption of practices. Again, if you look back at some of the information that David talked about, you really need to look and learn which growers will be most incentivized by anything you do to move to adoption. And talked about education, size of farms. There's lots of different things that go into that analysis, but there is studies out there, and they maybe read a lot of those studies to learn about these. So I have some action items. So I think the government, I'm talking primarily the federal government, should promote non-chemical weed management. Cover crop use is one example. Appropriate tillage. So I'm from Kentucky. And Kentucky has always prided itself since the development of no-tillage system as being one of the leaders, if not the leader in the country in that adoption. The farmers I talk to, the idea of tilling their lands, because they've been told so long, we have research that shows not tilling is a very good thing as far as soil health. But I think tilling once in a while is better than having to till all the time, because now you don't have a way to control your weeds. So appropriate periodic tillage. I think we have to find ways to do the scouting. I understand farms are bigger, it's harder, but I think we have to find ways to incentivize scouting. And I think we have to find ways to make sure that scouting that finds resistance is reported. How about diversity of herbicide use? Is this a place for government use and incentives? We'll talk about weed management plans. You've heard about them before. I think you've heard them called herbicide-resistant management plans. I think of herbicide-resistant management as a part of weed management, and that the overall plan is what we're talking about. So I do pay taxes. As a taxpayer, I really question whether I want my tax dollars going into prescribing how herbicides are used. But I do think the government has a big place in monitoring how herbicides are being used, looking at the use patterns not only of herbicides but other weed management practices, and making that information available on a regular basis so we can track how we're doing as far as diversity in our weed management systems. I also think the government should look at that conservation compliance. So we think about incentives as money, financial payments, but there's also disincentives. And so in some of these programs, again, tillage would be actually disincentivized by the practices and then the procedures and the policies. And there's a couple of ideas about crop insurance. So we could directly incentivize HRM in the crop insurance programs. As you've heard already, we're basically on a insurance plan payment to agriculture right now. And we can incorporate HRM into the good farming practices that are required for crop insurance claims. We should do this. Industry has a role here, of course. I think you need to use programs that incentivize diversity. And the diversity we've talked about mostly to this point has been diversity of adding perhaps a soil-applied material to your post-emergence program. What about actually rotating mechanisms of action as part of that incentive programs? I love to think that industry could find ways to incentivize even a diverser approach to weed management. Other taxes besides herbicides, but maybe that's a little bit beyond what we can go. Effective premixes and incentivizing those. So what do I mean by an effective premix? I mean one that you have two mechanisms of action that are equally effective against your target weeds. There's a lot of other ways you can incentivize a premix, and certainly price, because you're buying 2 materials or more from one company. You may be able looking at incentivizing that price advantage by lowering some of the rates on that premix. But I want to talk about only incentivizing what I call those fully effective premixes. They're effective and are used at full wakes of application. I was at an industry meeting a couple weeks ago, and I was really pleased because they were talking about how they could train their staff to understand herbicide resistance management. They wanted to set programs to train their staff. Well, we had a faculty meeting about a week ago talking about big change in the university and what they want us to do, and we even understand at the university that behavior follows the money. So I think that's great, you're going to train your staff, but I think you have to find ways to reward them for not only the training, but the practicing and the encouragement and the promotion of resistance management. So I actually think commodity groups do have a place in incentivizing the adoption of more resistance management. And you've heard about community groups, and as David said, we have some ideas, and I think part of those ideas relate to some of the commodity groups that might be able to, through their contact with their growers, and perhaps through some financial and other incentives, begin to establish some of these communities. I think this is a place for them. I would love to think that they had enough money to do more than this, but I think realistically this is a place that commodity groups really can have a place. I love the education they're doing. I love the Take Action program, but again, we're talking about doing something beyond where we are now, and this is a place I think commodity groups can go. Again, incentives must be temporary. Ask me how much it will cost, and I will give you, I won't even tell you it depends, I'll just tell you I don't know. There's a lot more smart people out in this audience dealing with these issues in a very detailed way to know better than me what this will cost and how to make it happen. But I've also been at meetings and saying, you don't start with a good idea and you start talking about all the reasons that can't work. It's a good idea, so you should find ways to make it work. So that's what I'm asking you to do. That's what we're asking you to do all day long, actually. Again, this is from my readings. This is from talking to economists and sociologists. You have to know how much it'll take to move somebody over that hurdle. As David has also talked about, there has to be clear rules for how you'll get these incentives. And then as you give those incentives, you really have to measure the impact they're having and reporting back. Okay, we're all happy to get money. We're probably mostly not happy to be regulated. We're probably not happy to be told and made to do things we don't really want to do. So we're going to talk about regulation. As Steve said, there is a place for government, and I think this is probably one of those places. We used to look at two major agencies as far as having a role in regulating herbicide resistance, USDA-APHIS and the EPA-OPP. Now, APHIS really governs the traits that might give selectivity for herbicides. So I really look at EPA-OPP as the organization that's making decisions, working with registrants about how these herbicides can be used. So that's where we're going to focus. Now, EPA has already been involved in resistance management. The whole BT resistance management program, from proactive refuges to reactive monitoring, reporting of non-performance, and follow-up, they have definitely been deeply involved in resistance management for this insecticide trait. They also are involved in that a registrant, when they identify and confirm a new case of resistance, will report that to the agency as an adverse effect. So my second question for you, could EPA-OPP do other things? Could they dictate herbicide use, proactively restricting the use of her products, either their rates or the frequency of their application. 1 is yes, 2 is no. You don't get to say, I don't know. On this one, it's yes or no. Interesting. So we didn't tell you earlier that we do know who's answering what, so I'll figure that out later. So almost 50-50, but certainly the majority in this room think, no, they couldn't do that. Well, I am not a lawyer either, but I think actually they can. So I think actually herbicides and other pesticides already have lots of things like how often you can use them, what rates you can use on that label because of environmental and other reasons. But I think a better example is if you look at fungicides particularly, but also many insecticides, the registrants come in and they already have a suggestion for their label that says this fungicide can only be used twice in a year. Before you can use that second application, you have to use these other modes of action. So I think actually industry is doing it. EPA is approving that label, but labels do have proactive resistance management labeling information on them already. So whether industry is doing it or EPA, I think it can happen. So we've generally, as a society, the WSSA, have not been supportive of doing proactive labeling. Why not? As you heard, this is probably the most difficult or expensive way to have these outcomes happen. And certainly difficult to enforce, but truthfully, I'm not sure it's more difficult to enforce than anything else on a label. One of the things that only really applies to new labels or products coming through the re-registration review. So it's not going to go back and change labels that are not being changed. And we need more than that. It reduces local adaptation and flexibility. All of us in agriculture want flexibility. We've heard many times there's no universal solution, so it's very hard from a national standpoint to prescribe herbicide use. It could remove an otherwise effective weed management tool. Steve talked about if you're in a place in Northland, the glyphosate is still effective. Manage it so you don't lose it. But you would not want to have a national policy that somehow restricted what those growers in that area could do, because it's still effective for them. And none of us like to be told what to do, but the image of American agriculture and the people who are really are doing the work are people who are very independent, and they really do not want to be told what to do. And I don't know if they would rebel, but certainly it may be counterproductive to try to dictate herbicide resistance management. But I definitely think EPA can take proactive measures. And certainly, once again, Steve brought up the fact that we don't have mandatory mechanism of action labeling. There's more to it than that, of course, but I know we've been moving to this. I definitely think we can move there. These are voluntary now, but if we can't get to where we need to be, I think EPA needs to go back and reconsider making them mandatory. So my action items for EPA require uniform mechanism of action labeling. Now, I think this is actually an unfair one, because I think we've all had a place in this. I think the commodity groups, I think the extension, academics, I think growers, I think retailers, we all need to be pressurizing those purveyors of herbicide products that did not have that information on their label to do this. Whatever pressure we can bring, I think we need to. I think we need to help EPA in this, because I think it can happen. It doesn't have to be mandatory if the people who have those products without this information see as a commercial disadvantage not to have it. Use of full label rates, I'll come back to this in a minute. And educational programs to explain effective mechanisms of action within these premixes. We had discussions with Steve over the week, and one of the things we talked about, a premix can be a wonderful resistance management tool to put into the diverse approach you have. It can be a terrible one if people think that mix is working together on one weed target, if it's not. What about other proactive things? I think EPA should question multiple uses of a single product in 1 year. I've heard industry presentations that say, well, we don't recommend you use this product more than twice a year, but if you need to, a third or fourth application. I think if you don't recommend it, then don't label it. I think we should be asking those things. How often, how much do we want to do these things? We know there is synergism in some of these mixtures. We clearly understand some of this. But in other cases where synergism is being claimed, it's very dubious. And when you're using a claim of synergism to put reduced rates into a premix, we haven't talked a lot about non-target site resistance, but reduced rates promote this type of resistance, and that is a disaster. It's probably worse than the target site. So come back to the less than full label rates. There's a lot of reasons we have a policy where it's illegal to put on more than the highest rate, but not illegal to put on less than the lowest rate that's on the label. Maybe we need to rethink that. I know there's environmental and other reasons you might like to use lower rates. Certainly growers want to see how little they can get away with many times. But if we're really talking about serious resistance management, maybe you need to rethink that policy. What about reactive regulations? Require scouting before and after herbicide application. I know this is hard. I know that there are farms that are big. I know that labor is limited. But let's find ways to do it. I actually think technology does have a place to play if the FDA will let us fly maybe some drones. Require a registrant to establish an active monitoring and mitigation program for new resistance cases. I think, yes, we need to know that it's starting to happen, and we need to do something about it as quickly as we can, as early as we can. Show of hands, how many people agree with this statement? 1, 2, 3 regulators. Yeah, they're all, yeah. This is their job, so believe me, take it seriously. So I think it's very, very positive that clearly EPA is concerned about this issue and they're taking steps to combat its evolution and spread. One reason I think that's a good thing, because my colleagues, my friends, the economists and sociologists tell me the threat, a credible threat of regulatory action, very often will scare people into doing what they don't want to do otherwise. So I think that's another incentive we have out there, is that the threat of credible regulation, things that people don't want to have regulated, might move them in a direction to prevent that. Now, we talked about EPA a lot. There's a couple other things that came to mind as I worked on this. We talked a lot about these weed management programs. What if we had weed management programs being required, just like we have nutrient management program requires? We have TSPs for weed management, and these are required for these federal programs. Here's some examples of those programs. Oh, don't answer that question yet. I actually think it's a crime that Parma amaranth, resistant Parma amaranth, was moved from south of Kentucky all the way to Michigan in agricultural products. I think that's, we talked a lot about mobility and other things. I think that was devastating and wrong. And so I think we need to look at ways to limit that from happening from the next case of resistance, wherever it is and wherever it happens. We have a thing called National Plant Board that oversees basically the seed regulating organization in all the states. We have state seed laws. We have noxious weed list. We need to use these kind of things wherever we can to not have that happen again. So one more question for you. Would regulations have made a difference in preventing or at least slowing the development of widespread ALS, because as was pointed out earlier, ALS resistance was very widespread just about the time the glyphosate tolerant crops came on, or glyphosate resistance? Yes, 1. No, 2. 3, I have no clue. Well, there's more than a few regulators in this audience. Jill was very reluctant to give opinions, and I definitely respect that. I'm not nearly so constrained. I think it could have made a difference too. I may not be giving you the right ones. There may have been better ones, but I think it could have made a difference if we'd done something differently. And looking forward, that's what we're talking about, doing something differently than what we did in the past. So let's not just repeat it. Thank you, and I don't ask for questions, I just ask for comments.
If it's okay with the audience, I'd like to hold comments for this presentation until after the next one, because some of the comments may be answered by the next one. And we'll have plenty of time for comments on both, if that's okay. And if it's not, we're going to do it anyway. Thank you. Okay, the next speaker is Dr. Jack Hausinger, who's the relatively new director of EPA's Office of Pesticide Programs, to give us EPA's perspective. I've known Jack for several years, and I always really appreciated his approach to things, and we're glad to have you here. Just turns it on.